She was the woman tasked with pouring water, a trembling ghost in the background that nobody ever noticed. They saw her as nothing. But they were profoundly mistaken. The moment the undisputed king of Sicily, Don Salvatore Moretti, entered Il Giglio, all the oxygen vanished from the grand dining room. Men who took lives for a living suddenly found their palms sweating inside expensive tailored suits. Yet, when the timid waitress came to their table, she did not spill a single drop or allow her voice to crack. Instead, she met the gaze of the most feared man alive and uttered 5 simple words. It was a dialect so old and so specific that it had not been spoken outside the remote hills of Corleone since 1990. The entire restaurant did not merely fall quiet, it became frozen in time. What she said was not a polite greeting. It was a pronouncement of death, and in that entire room, only 3 people understood its true meaning. This is the incredible story of Sophia, the waitress who concealed an entire kingdom under her simple uniform. This story will prove that in a world full of wolves, the most dangerous creature isn't the one with the sharpest teeth. It's the one who knows exactly when to strike. It will show you that being invisible is not a weakness. It's your greatest weapon. If you've ever been dismissed as nobody, underestimated, or overlooked, this story is for you. Stay until the very end. The dinner service at Il Giglio was never just a job. It was a carefully orchestrated storm of controlled hysteria. Positioned in the very core of Manhattan's financial district, the restaurant stood as a monument to marble, rich mahogany, and generational wealth. This was the type of establishment where a single bottle of wine was worth more than Sophia's monthly rent, and the patrons whispered about hostile takeovers, corporate mergers, and other activities that would put any normal citizen behind the bars of a federal penitentiary. Sophia Rossi pulled the strings of her apron so tight she could feel them biting into her skin. In the polished brass surface of the massive espresso machine, she examined her own reflection. She saw the dark, exhausted circles beneath her eyes, her hair hastily tied in a messy bun, and a uniform that was clearly one size too large. She appeared exactly as she intended, entirely unmemorable. Rossi. Table 4 is waiting for water. Now. The floor manager, a perpetually sweating man named Mr. Henderson, who carried the scent of stale coffee and failure, barked as he snapped his fingers inches from her face. Yes, sir. I am going right now, Sophia murmured, deliberately fixing her gaze upon the floor. She glided through the bustling dining room as if she were a phantom. This was her greatest skill. She had discovered long ago that her very survival depended on being completely unseen. If you were invisible, you could never be harmed. If you remained silent, you could never become a target. For 3 long years, she had existed as a specter in the vastness of New York City, always paying for her small sublet in Queens with cash, finding work that was off the books, and never, ever holding a person's gaze for more than a heartbeat. But this particular evening, the atmosphere inside Il Giglio felt unusually dense. It was not the standard pressure of a busy Friday night. This feeling was heavier, more charged with danger. The kitchen crew had been visibly tense since 4 p.m. The head chef, a notoriously temperamental Frenchman who typically used plates for target practice, was now silently and obsessively cleaning his own counters. A major party is on their way in, Marco, a young busboy, whispered while stacking a tray next to Sophia. The owner himself called, he added, his voice low. Said to clear out the whole VIP mezzanine level. An unsettling chill traced its way down Sophia's spine. Who is it? A senator? Marco just shook his head, his eyes growing wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Much bigger. It is the Morettis. The water glass in Sophia's hand jolted, a full inch before her fingers tightened around it again, saving it from falling. A cold splash of ice water stung her wrist. Moretti. In some parts of the city, that name was treated like a vile curse. To the public and in the newspapers, they were presented as legitimate businessmen, experts in waste management, or international shipping tycoons. But in the shadowed alleys of the city where Sophia desperately tried to avoid, they were the ultimate authority. Dante Moretti represented the modern face of the family, a man known for being handsome, ruthless, and clinically corporate. But if the entire mezzanine was being cleared, it meant only one thing: the old king himself was visiting. "I need to take my break," Sophia suddenly announced, her voice shaking almost uncontrollably. "No one gets a break," Henderson snapped from across the room. "They have arrived. Everyone, form a line by the stairs, now." Sophia's heart began to pound against her ribs like a frantic, caged animal. Leaving was no longer an option. To flee at this moment would only draw the worst kind of attention. To be noticed by these men was to be erased. She obediently took her position at the very end of the service line, her head bowed low, sending a silent prayer to a god she had long forgotten, pleading that her invisibility would hold. The massive front doors swung inward, and the ambient temperature of the room seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. The security team entered first, 4 imposing men who looked as though they were chiseled from solid granite, their dead eyes methodically sweeping every corner of the room. Following them was Dante Moretti. Sophia dared to peek through her lowered eyelashes. He was terrifyingly handsome, dressed in a charcoal suit that seemed molded to his body. He moved with the fluid, predatory grace of a jungle cat, his dark hair combed back perfectly, his jaw clenched with a grim and focused intensity. He gave the impression of a man who was utterly bored by the necessity of violence, but also exceptionally skilled at it. Yet, the room had not frozen for Dante. It held its breath for the man who followed him. Don Salvatore Moretti, the capo of the old world. He appeared to be in his late 60s, relying heavily on a polished ebony cane that was crowned with a gleaming silver lion's head. He was dressed in a classic fedora and a long dark wool coat, making him look like a figure from a bygone era. His face was a testament to a hard life, a roadmap of old scars and deep wrinkles, with his eyes concealed behind dark-tinted glasses. A profound silence fell over the entire restaurant. Forks paused in midair. Lively conversations simply ceased to exist. Mr. Henderson was practically shaking with anxiety. "Welcome, Don Moretti. Mr. Moretti, it is such an honor." Dante merely lifted one hand, silencing him instantly. "The table, now." "Of course. This way, please." As the group made its way past the terrified line of staff, Sophia repeated a mantra in her mind. "Do not look up. Do not look up. Do not look up." Then, Don Salvatore came to a complete stop. He was standing directly in front of her. The rich aroma of expensive cigars and aged leather enveloped her. Sophia kept her eyes fixed on the perfectly polished tips of his Italian leather shoes. "This one," Salvatore stated, his voice raspy, like stones grinding together. "She is trembling." Dante let out a weary sigh, the sound full of exhaustion. "Papa, please, let us just sit. The girl is simply nervous." "Fear is a useful thing," Salvatore murmured softly. He then tapped the toe of Sophia's shoe with his cane. "Look at me, bambina." Sophia squeezed her eyelids shut for a fraction of a second, channeling all of her energy into the character she had so carefully constructed over the years. The timid, frightened, insignificant girl. She slowly raised her head, making her eyes wide and allowing her lower lip to quiver pathetically. "I am so sorry, sir," she stammered, pitching her voice much higher than its natural tone. I have never seen a real famous person up close before." Salvatore studied her for a long moment, his dark, sharp eyes boring into hers. For one terrifying second, Sophia was certain he could see straight through her cheap uniform, past the manufactured fear, and all the way down to the very blood that coursed through her veins. But then, he let out a laugh. It was a dry, wheezing sound that echoed in the silent room. "Famous, yes. Fetch us our wine, little mouse, and be certain you do not drop it." They continued on their way. Sophia finally let out a slow breath, only then noticing that her knees were literally knocking against each other. She had made it through their arrival, but she knew the ordeal of the night was only just beginning. Dante Moretti unfastened the button on his suit jacket as he took his seat, his gaze sweeping across the mezzanine. The area was secure. His men were positioned perfectly at the top of the stairwell and by the kitchen entrance. Despite the precautions, he could not bring himself to relax. His father's presence in New York was a constant logistical and strategic nightmare. Salvatore simply refused to understand that the world had moved on. He had no regard for RICO statutes or the ever-present threat of surveillance cameras. All he cared about was respect. He demanded wine, and he was determined to critique every aspect of Dante's management of the— This is a story about power. Not the kind that comes from a gun, but the kind that keeps you safe when you have nothing else. It begins with an injustice inside the American branch of the Moretti family. The design of this place has no soul, Salvatore complained, waving a dismissive hand toward the towering ceilings and cold, sterile walls. It feels like a bank. Dante sighed. Do you often dine inside a bank, Papa? It is a modern style, Papa. This is what the customers appreciate now, Dante explained, catching the eye of the sommelier. He didn't actually want the wine steward. What he desperately needed was a double scotch, neat. But this evening was meant to honor tradition, and customers like what we instruct them to like, Salvatore lectured, his voice a low rumble. He scanned the men seated around the massive table. His old consigliere, Rocco, and two of his most trusted Sicilian guards were statues of silence. Where is that girl? I require more wine. Seeing the signal, Henderson nearly tripped over himself to shove the terrified young waitress toward the looming staircase. Dante observed her slow, hesitant approach. She was a small thing, her face pale and drawn, with wide, frantic brown eyes that darted around the room. She was clutching the heavy bottle of Barolo as if it were an explosive device set to detonate. Dante thought to himself, she looks like she might actually collapse. Wonderful. Just another complication to manage tonight. Open the bottle, Salvatore commanded, his voice cutting through the tension. As Sophia finally reached the table, Dante saw that her hands were trembling violently. But as he continued to watch, he witnessed something remarkable. The very instant the corkscrew made contact with the bottle, her shaking ceased completely. Her movements transformed, becoming deliberate, precise, and impossibly fluid. The leverage she applied was flawless. The sound of the cork leaving the bottle was a barely more than a soft whisper. It was a flawless, professional pour. She did not allow a single drop to spill. How interesting, Dante mused. Nerves of solid steel appear when it is time to work. She carefully placed the wine glass in front of Salvatore. The old Don slowly swirled the deep red liquid, inhaled its aroma, and then peered up at her, a mischievous sparkle appearing in his eyes. He was playing a game with her. He always subjected the staff to these little tests. It was a cruel power play he thoroughly enjoyed, making ordinary people squirm under his gaze. You are Italian? Salvatore asked her, speaking in English. Yes, sir, my grandmother, she whispered in response. Where is she from? Naples, sir. Salvatore scoffed loudly, waving his hand in a gesture of dismissal. Naples, a city of noisy people, thieves, and street singers. Dante noticed the waitress's jaw muscle clench. It was a tiny, fractional movement, a flicker of an emotion that was definitely not fear. It almost looked like wounded pride. Salvatore then leaned farther across the table, making a deliberate switch to standard Italian. Do you comprehend this language? Or are you simply another American girl who happens to have a vowel at the end of her name? Sophia respectfully lowered her head. I understand a little, signore, she replied, her Italian passable, but clearly broken. Salvatore just smirked. He then turned to his consigliere, Rocco, and switched languages once more. This time, he was not speaking English, nor was he speaking standard Italian. He slipped into the heavy, guttural dialect of the Sicilian countryside, using a hyper-localized slang from the mountains surrounding Corleone. It was the language of shepherds and ancient bandits, a secret tongue that was completely incomprehensible to almost all other Italians. "Look at this one, Rocco," Salvatore said in the dialect, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "She has a pretty face, but her eyes are completely vacant, like a sheep waiting to be led to the slaughter. We could bring her back to the villa. She could warm a bed for a night before we get rid of her." It was a crude, deliberately brutal test of his surroundings. Salvatore often made shocking statements in the dialect just to see if anyone in the vicinity would flinch. If they reacted, he knew they understood and were a potential threat. If they did not, they were harmless. Dante grew rigid in his chair. He despised it when his father spoke in that crude manner. "Papa, that is enough," he warned sharply in English. But then, the unthinkable happened. Sophia had been backing away from the table, clutching the service tray to her chest like a shield. She should have continued walking away. She should have maintained her role as the invisible girl. But that insult, the specific, vulgar comparison of her to a sheep for the butcher, struck a nerve buried so deep inside her that it completely bypassed her years of trained survival instincts. She stopped moving. She slowly turned back to face the table. The silence that fell was absolute and suffocating. Dante stared at her, utterly confused. Was she about to burst into tears? Sophia lifted her head and looked directly at Salvatore. The terror had vanished completely from her features, replaced by something cold and ancient. Her entire bearing transformed in an instant. Her shoulders straightened, her head tilted upward, and for one heart-stopping second, she possessed the terrifying grace of a queen. When she finally spoke, her voice was not the thin, nervous whisper of a simple waitress. Instead, a deep guttural tone emerged, each word delivered with a flawless, rhythmic cadence that chilled the air. She said, "The sheep that lives to see the dawn is the one who watches the wolf sleep, Don Salvatore." Then she added, her eyes locking onto his, "And a guest who insults the bread of his host will eat ashes by morning." She was speaking his dialect, not merely Sicilian, but the specific archaic version from the heart of the Moretti family's ancient stronghold. It was a version of the language that carried words which had not been in common use since the 1970s. The silence that followed was shattered by a deafening clang. Rocco's silver fork had slipped from his grasp, striking the fine china with a sound like a gunshot. At the far end of the long table, the two bodyguards moved as one, their hands instantly disappearing inside their tailored jackets as their gazes fixed on Sophia like predators. Yet, Dante remained completely still, frozen in his seat. He was physically unable to move. His attention was riveted on his father. For the very first time in his entire life, Dante witnessed Don Salvatore Moretti appearing utterly and profoundly stunned. The old man's jaw was slack, his mouth hanging slightly agape. All the color had drained from his weathered face, leaving it a pale, waxy mask. He stared at Sophia, no longer seeing a waitress, but looking at her as if she were an apparition from a forgotten grave. "Who are you?" Salvatore finally breathed, the words escaping as a trembling whisper. Just like that, the enchantment shattered. The regal composure vanished from Sophia's face, replaced by a wave of pure, horrified panic. Her eyes went wide as the full weight of her mistake came crashing down upon her with brutal force. The mask she had worn for years had not just slipped, it had disintegrated. She had just exposed her true self directly in front of the most dangerous and unforgiving family on the entire continent. I need to go get the antipasto," she stammered, the words tumbling out in a desperate gasp. She spun around and fled. This was not a hurried walk or a quick retreat. She sprinted with the explosive speed of a hunted animal, heading directly for the swinging kitchen doors. "Get her!" Salvatore bellowed, his voice a thunderous roar as he slammed his heavy cane down on the tabletop, causing a crystal wine glass to explode into 1,000 glittering shards. "Bring that woman to me this instant!" Dante was already rising from his chair before the command was finished. "You all stay right here," he commanded his men, his mind racing 1,000 miles an hour. He vaulted over the low, ornate railing of the private mezzanine, landing silently on the floor below, and immediately took off in pursuit of the woman. He blasted through the kitchen doors a moment later, just in time to catch a glimpse of the restaurant's back exit swinging violently shut. "Out of the way!" Dante yelled, forcefully shoving a terrified sous chef aside who was frozen in his path. He kicked the heavy steel door open and burst out into the deluge of the rain-soaked alleyway behind the building. He scanned left, then right, his eyes piercing the gloom. At the very far end of the narrow passage, he spotted her. She moved with incredible speed and agility. She was already scaling a tall chain-link fence, climbing with a fluid, practiced dexterity that no ordinary waitress should ever possess. "Stop right there!" Dante shouted, his hand moving on pure instinct toward the holstered firearm, nestled at the small of his back. She hesitated for a moment at the very top of the fence, half sprawled over the chain link, and looked back directly at him. Illuminated by the sickly, harsh yellow glow of a nearby street lamp, their eyes met across the distance. Dante had fully expected to see raw terror in her gaze. What he found instead was cold, hard calculation. She was not fleeing like a helpless victim. She was executing a tactical retreat, like a trained soldier disengaging from a compromised position. "You have no idea of the consequences of what you have done," Dante called out to her, taking a cautious step forward into the downpour. "I know precisely who you are, Dante Moretti," she called back, her voice ringing out with astonishing clarity and steadiness over the sound of the rain. "And what I also know is that if your father ever discovers my true identity, he will not just have me killed. He will burn this entire city to the ground, to be sure." She dropped down onto the pavement on the other side of the fence and was instantly swallowed by the shadows of the night. Dante stood there alone in the relentless rain, his heart pounding as adrenaline coursed through him. He raised a hand and touched the small earpiece he wore. "Boss!" The voice of his head of security crackled urgently in his ear. "Should we initiate a full lockdown of the restaurant?" "To hell with the restaurant," Dante snarled, his gaze fixed on the empty fence that she had so easily conquered. "Find that girl. I want you to find out everything about her, and under no circumstances are you to let my father get his hands on her first." Sophia did not stop running until her lungs felt like they had been scoured with hot coals, burning as if she had swallowed fire. She moved in a frantic, zigzagging pattern through the confusing maze of Tribeca's streets, deliberately doubling back through dark alleys and cutting through a crowded subway station without ever boarding a train, before finally emerging a full 6 blocks from where she started. She slipped quietly into a 24-hour laundromat, collapsing onto a hard plastic chair in the dimly lit back corner, effectively concealed from the street by a long row of churning, vibrating dryers. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead tightly against her knees, desperately trying to command the violent shaking in her limbs to stop. Stupid, stupid, utterly and completely stupid. She had maintained this careful deception for 3 long years. 3 years of painstakingly dyeing her hair this drab, mousy brown color. 3 years of wearing baggy, unflattering clothes that completely hid the shape of her body. 3 years of ruthlessly suppressing the fiery spirit that was her birthright. And tonight, she had carelessly thrown all of that meticulous work away, all because of a single, foolish insult. But it was never just an insult, was it? It was that specific dialect. Hearing those old words had awakened a kind of muscle memory deep within her, a raw, visceral response that came from a childhood she had fought so hard to bury beneath layers of lies. Her phone began to buzz in her pocket. It was a burner, a cheap, prepaid flip phone that she kept hidden away only for the most dire emergencies. Just one person in the entire world had this number. She nervously flipped it open. A single text message glowed on the tiny screen. "They are looking. Leave the apartment now. Sophia stared blankly at the words. With a surge of desperate strength, she crushed the flimsy plastic of the phone in her hand, then broke the tiny SIM card in two and dropped all the broken pieces into a nearby trash can, overflowing with discarded dryer sheets. She could not return to Queens. Her small apartment was now compromised. Her entire emergency stash of cash was hidden beneath the floorboards there, along with the forged passport that identified her as a woman named Maria Fiore. That identity was gone now. She was Sophia Rossi once more. Or more accurately, she was finally forced to be the person she was always born to be. She quickly checked her pockets. $50 in tips, the key to her locker, and a small pocket knife she had carried with her for as long as she could remember. "Okay," she whispered to the rhythmic humming of the washing machines around her. "Think. What would Papa do in this situation?" The mere thought of her father brought with it a fresh, stabbing wave of pain. Do not think about the blood. Think about the lesson he taught you. Lesson number 4. When the wolf is hot on your trail, you do not run for the safety of the den. You run toward the water. She forced herself to stand, wiped the tear tracks from her face with the back of her hand, and walked purposefully out of the laundromat and back into the rainy night. Her new destination was clear. She had to get to the docks in Red Hook. An old associate of her family was there, a man who owed them a sacred debt that even death itself had not managed to cancel. In the meantime, back at Il Giulio, the atmosphere had become as heavy and grim as a funeral. The entire restaurant had been completely cleared of all patrons. The terrified staff were now being held in the main kitchen, their cell phones confiscated and placed in a pile on a steel counter. Dante paced relentlessly back and forth across the private dining room, his eyes constantly flicking toward his father. Don Salvatore was seated silently in a large armchair, his vacant gaze fixed on a blank, tapestry-covered wall. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in the span of a single hour. He was drinking grappa straight from a tumbler, his hand trembling so slightly it was almost imperceptible. "Papa?" Dante began, deliberately keeping his voice low and calm. "The boys are currently scrubbing all the closed-circuit television footage. We managed to run a trace on her employee file, but it was a dead end. The social security number was fake, and the address she listed does not exist. As far as the system is concerned, she is a ghost." Salvatore did not even turn to look at him. "She spoke the Arboresci of the inner circle, Dante. It was not just the dialect. It was the code that is spoken within it." "I heard her," Dante confirmed, pouring a drink for himself as well. "She made a threat against you. She said you would eat ash." "No," Salvatore corrected him, his tone suddenly sharp and cutting. "That was not a threat. It was a proverb. A guest who insults the host's bread. It is a saying that the wives of the capos would use to admonish the young, arrogant men when they became too full of themselves. It is a phrase meant for correction, a phrase that carries authority." Salvatore finally turned to look at his son, and his eyes were haunted by ghosts of the past. Only one family in all of Sicily ever used that exact specific phrasing: the Valentis. Dante froze in place. The heavy glass in his hand stopped halfway to his lips. "The Valentis are dead. You killed them all. Every last one of them. The night of long knives, back in 1998. You completely wiped out their bloodline." "I thought that I had," Salvatore whispered, his voice raspy with memory. "Giovanni Valenti. He had a daughter. Her name was Sophia. She was only 12 years old on the night that the house burned to the ground. We located a body. The teeth were a perfect match for her dental records." "Dental records can be easily faked if you have access to enough money and influence," Dante said, his mind racing to connect the impossible dots. The Valenti family had been the only rival clan that had ever posed a genuine challenge to the Morettis for the absolute control of Sicily. They were an ancient line, known for being ruthless, but they also possessed a strange kind of honor that the modern mob completely lacked. "If that young woman is truly Sofia Valente," Salvatore continued, his voice hardening and transforming into cold steel. Then she is the rightful inheritor of a blood vendetta that demands my head be served on a platter. And she has been the one serving me water for how long, Dante? 6 months, Dante replied, the words feeling like ice in his own throat. He felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. He had walked right past her nearly every single day. He had barely even registered her existence. And during all that time, she could have put poison in his food, slipped a knife between his ribs, or burned the entire establishment down around them. Why had she not acted? Find her, Dante, Salvatore commanded, pushing himself to his feet and leaning heavily on his ornate cane. The momentary frailty he had shown was completely gone. The lion was back in command. Find her before the Russos or any of our other enemies discover that she exists. If they learn that a Valente is still alive, they will undoubtedly rally to her cause. It will ignite a civil war that will tear our world apart. I will bring her to you, Dante promised, his voice resolute. Alive, Salvatore added, his tone leaving no room for argument. I want to look directly into her eyes when I finally finish the work that I started more than 20 years ago. Dante gave a single, sharp nod and turned to depart. But as he walked out of the restaurant and into the cool, rain-washed night air, he made a silent, profound decision. He would indeed find Sofia Valente. However, he was no longer certain that he was going to deliver her to his father. Because for the first time in his entire life, Dante Moretti was genuinely intrigued. And for a man who had been given everything he could ever want, a true mystery was the only prize left in the world that was worth chasing. The rain in New York City never washes anything clean. It just adds a slick, greasy sheen to the existing grime. By the time Sophia finally made it to Red Hook, the relentless storm had transformed the cityscape into a blurry, distorted watercolor of smeared neon and oppressive gray. The docks appeared to be a veritable graveyard, littered with rusted shipping containers and towering cranes that looked like the skeletal remains of long-dead prehistoric monsters. She limped unevenly toward a dilapidated bait and tackle shop that stood precariously at the very edge of Pier 41. From the outside, it looked completely abandoned. The windows were boarded over with sheets of plywood that had clearly rotted around the nails holding them in place. But Sophia knew the truth. She knew that 3 feet below the waterline, attached to the pilings, was a sophisticated pressure sensor. If you failed to knock on the front door using the correct rhythm, 2 quick taps, a slow one, then 3 more quick taps, a shotgun that was cleverly rigged just behind the frame would instantly turn your chest into a bloody pulp. She raised her fist and knocked. Rat-a-tat, thud, rat-a-tat-tat. A long, tense silence hung in the air. Then came the awful, high-pitched screech of a rusty deadbolt being reluctantly slid back. The door cracked open just enough to reveal a sliver of absolute darkness and the cold, menacing barrel of a Remington 870. "We are closed," a voice rasped from within. It sounded like heavy iron chains being dragged across a concrete floor. "The tide is high, Enzo," Sophia said, her voice remarkably steady despite the uncontrollable shivering that racked her exhausted body. "But the fish are not biting tonight." The shotgun barrel was lowered in an instant. The door swung open wide. Enzo, the man they once called the butcher, stood there, filling the doorway. He had to be at least 70 years old, and he was wearing a grease-stained tank top that showed off arms completely covered in the faded ink of old prison tattoos. He had once been her father's most trusted and loyal lieutenant, the very same man who had smuggled her out of Sicily all those years ago, wrapped tightly in an old rug and hidden on a fishing trawler on the terrible night her entire family was murdered. "Sophia," he breathed out, his eyes going wide with disbelief. He quickly pulled her through the doorway and threw the heavy door shut, engaging 3 separate noisy locks. "My God, I was certain you were in Queens. I believed you were completely safe." "I was safe," Sophia answered, her back pressing against a tall stack of wooden lobster traps. She let herself slide down the rough wood until she was sitting on the cold, damp concrete floor. That was true until tonight. I saw him, Enzo. I actually saw Salvatore. The color drained from Enzo's face completely. He rushed to her side, pressing a worn, ragged towel and a bottle of inexpensive brandy into her hands. You saw him? Did he see you? He saw a waitress, Sophia replied, taking a long drink of the liquor that burned its way down her throat. But then he made a joke, an insult to our family, using the old dialect. And I could not stop myself, Enzo. I answered him back. Enzo squeezed his eyes shut and let out a quiet, bitter curse in Italian. You spoke to the devil in his own language. Now the entire pack will be on the hunt. I need the package, Enzo, she demanded, her gaze locking onto his. The one my father left for me. Enzo paused, his expression filled with conflict. He looked down at the young woman he had secretly protected from the world's dangers for 20 long years. That is a death sentence, Sophia. The moment you open that box, your life as a waitress is over forever. You become the dawn again. You become the primary target. I am already the target, she declared, pushing herself to her feet. All the crushing exhaustion seemed to melt away from her, replaced by an ice-cold, razor-sharp anger. Give it to me. Enzo let out a long sigh, utterly defeated by the fire in her eyes. It was the very same intense look her father, Giovanni Valente, always had just before he gave the order for a man to die. He moved behind the bait counter and used a knife to pry up a floorboard that had always been loose. From the dark hidden space below, he lifted out a heavy steel briefcase carefully wrapped in oilcloth. He set it down on the counter with a heavy thud. Sophia slowly traced the cold, hard lines of the metal with her fingertips. Inside that case was everything. The access codes to all the Valente family's offshore bank accounts, the complete list of sleeper agents her father had positioned all across Europe, and the most critical item of all, the Libro Rosso, the infamous Red Book. That book held detailed proof of every single bribe, every murder, and every act of betrayal carried out by the other 5 families over the last 30 years. It was the ultimate form of leverage, a weapon of mass destruction in their world. Take it, Enzo urged. There is a boat waiting at the very end of the pier. The key to the Lucia is hidden under the welcome mat. Get to Jersey. I will do my best to delay them if they show up here. They are not coming for you, Enzo, she said with a soft, sad voice. They have no idea that you are still alive. A sudden, violent crash from above made them both look up. The skylight exploded inward. Shards of glass rained down around them like glittering, deadly diamonds. Thick ropes immediately dropped from the exposed ceiling beams. Before Enzo could even lift his shotgun, a flashbang grenade landed and detonated right in the middle of the room. The entire world flashed a brilliant, blinding white. A painful, high-pitched ringing sound screamed inside Sophia's ears. The force of the blast threw her backward into the lobster traps. The air was violently forced from her lungs. Peering through the thick smoke and ignoring the piercing sound, she could see dark figures rappelling down from the ceiling. They were covered in tactical gear, wearing night vision goggles, and their rifles had suppressors. This was not the police, and it was certainly not the usual street soldiers from the Moretti family. This was a team of highly trained, military-grade professionals. Enzo let out a furious roar, firing his shotgun blindly into the swirling smoke. A loud boom echoed in the small shop. One of the dark shadows crumpled to the floor, but then 3 distinct red laser dots appeared and converged on the center of Enzo's chest. No! Sophia screamed, scrambling desperately for the steel briefcase. The suppressed rifles coughed 3 times in quick succession. Enzo's body jerked backward as if struck by a hammer, 3 dark holes appearing on his shirt. He slumped forward over the counter, already gone before his body came to rest on the wood. Sophia had no time for grief. Her survival instincts took complete control. She grabbed the handle of the briefcase and threw herself to the right, just as a spray of bullets tore apart the floorboards where she had been a second before. She scrambled for cover behind a large, heavy industrial freezer, knowing she had to get to the back door. She kicked the freezer door open with all her might, using it as a temporary shield, and made a desperate run for the rear exit. Bullets sparked and whined off the metal doorframe as she burst through it and onto the slick, rotting wood of the pier. The downpour had become a torrential flood of rain. The wind howled like a hungry animal. She sprinted with all her might toward the Lucia, a small fishing boat that was being tossed violently in the rough water. "There is nowhere left to run, Principessa," a man's voice yelled, cutting through the noise of the storm. Sophia's feet slid on the wet planks as she came to an abrupt stop. Standing directly between her and the safety of the boat was Dante Moretti. He was by himself. He held a handgun loosely at his side, the barrel pointed toward the ground. He was not wearing any tactical gear. He was completely soaked in his expensive, ruined suit, and his dark hair was plastered flat against his forehead. "You brought them right to me," Sophia spat out, clutching the briefcase tightly to her chest as she began to back away toward the pier's edge. "I did not bring anyone," Dante yelled back, taking a careful step toward her. "I came here alone. Look at them, Sophia. Those are not my people." Sophia risked a quick glance over her shoulder at the bait shop. The entire tactical team was now pouring out of the back door she had just escaped from. They were raising their weapons, aiming not only at her, but at Dante as well. "Drop the weapon, Moretti," the lead commando shouted over the wind, "or our orders are to clean the whole slate." For just a fraction of a second, Dante's face was a mask of pure confusion. "What?" "It is a coup, you idiot!" Sophia screamed at him. "Get down!" She did not try to run. She did not jump into the freezing water. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her waitress apron. In a moment of bitter irony, she realized she was still wearing the damned thing. She pulled out the second flashbang grenade, the one she had scooped up from the floor of the bait shop when the first soldier had fallen. She pulled the pin with her teeth and hurled it in a high arc over Dante's head, aiming it perfectly at the group of soldiers. The grenade went off with another deafening bang. Dante flinched away, instinctively shielding his eyes from the blinding flash. When he could see again, the tactical team was in complete disarray, stumbling around, temporarily blinded and confused. "Move!" Sophia yelled, grabbing Dante by the lapel of his $1,000 suit and forcefully dragging him toward the edge of the pier. "What in the hell are you doing?" Dante shouted, struggling against her pull. "I am saving your life, so I get to be the one to kill you later." With that, she shoved him with all her strength. Dante stumbled backward, his arms flailing, and then toppled off the pier, hitting the freezing, oil-slicked water of the Hudson River with a huge splash. Sophia clutched the briefcase to her chest and leaped into the dark water right after him. Bullets ripped through the surface of the water just above them, creating trails of bubbles that looked like a swarm of angry wasps. But the river's dark, powerful current quickly pulled them under, swallowing them completely. The area beneath Pier 41 was a dark forest of thick, rotting wooden pilings covered in barnacles. The air was thick with a toxic mixture of raw sewage and gasoline. Dante Moretti broke the surface, gasping desperately for air in the oppressive gloom under the pier. The water was so cold, it felt like being stabbed with 1,000 icy needles. He thrashed in the water, his hands searching for something to hold onto on a slippery crossbeam. "Be quiet!" a voice hissed out of the nearby darkness. He instantly went still. Sophia was clinging to a piling just 3 feet away from him. The steel briefcase was now strapped securely to her wrist with her own belt. She was shivering uncontrollably, her thin waitress uniform stuck to her skin, but her eyes were sharp and focused on the narrow gaps in the floorboards directly above their heads. The heavy thud of combat boots stomped just feet away. Bright beams from powerful flashlights cut through the cracks, slicing through the darkness below them like swords. "Clear!" a voice echoed from above them. "They must have gone under." The current has probably already taken them out to sea. Deploy the thermal drone. Thermal, Dante whispered, a new wave of panic rising in his chest. We have to move right now. Shut up, Sophia snapped back, her voice low and firm. You follow me. You stay low in the water. If you make a splash, I will leave you behind. She pushed off from the piling, moving through the water with a silent, powerful frog kick, disappearing deeper into the maze of the underpier. Dante followed her, his large muscles already starting to cramp and seize from the intense cold. He was a boxer, a skilled shooter, a man who spent 2 hours every day in a gym, but he was finding it nearly impossible to keep up with the slender young woman who had been serving him wine just 2 hours earlier. She guided him to a rusted maintenance ladder that was completely covered in slick green algae. They climbed up out of the water and into a storm drain tunnel that ran deep beneath the West Side Highway. The tunnel was mostly dry, and it smelled of damp earth and rats. They both collapsed onto a concrete ledge, gasping for air, their breathing echoing in the confined space. Dante rolled onto his back and stared up at the curved, dark ceiling. Those men, he said between breaths. They were wearing Russian-made gear, but they spoke perfect English with American accents. Mercenaries, Sophia stated simply, wringing the river water out of her long hair. She quickly checked the briefcase. The seals were still tight. High-end private contractors. Who hired them? Dante asked, pushing himself into a sitting position. My father? Sophia let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor at all. Your father wants the satisfaction of killing me himself. He would never send a faceless hit squad to blow up a little bait shop. He is old school. He would want to look me directly in the eye. She turned her body to face him fully. The dim, weak light from a street grate high above cast long, dancing shadows across her determined face. And besides, they tried to kill you too, Dante. You saw the lasers on your chest. If I had not thrown that flashbang, your brains would be painting the docks right now. Dante fell silent, the truth of her words hitting him hard. She was right. The order had been to clean the entire slate. Someone wants a war, Dante said slowly, the pieces finally starting to click together in his mind. If I die, and the last Valente dies tonight, who stands to gain from that? Chaos always benefits the hungry, Sophia said, quoting an old family proverb. She shivered again, wrapping her arms tightly around herself to fight the cold. The Russos are too clumsy for an operation with this kind of precision. The Costellos are too broke to afford it. It has to be someone on the inside, Dante realized, and the thought tasted like poison in his mouth. Someone who knew exactly where I was going tonight. Only 3 people knew I was tracking you to Red Hook. Your father, Sophia listed off. No, he would never kill me. Your head of security, Thorne. Dante shook his head firmly. Thorne took a bullet for me last year. He is completely loyal. Loyalty always has an expiration date when the price is high enough, Sophia countered, her voice cold. Who else? Dante hesitated for a moment. Rocco, my father's consigliere. Sophia's eyes narrowed at the name. Rocco, the same man who was sitting at your table tonight, the one who laughed when your father called me a helpless sheep. He has been with my family since before I was even born, Dante said, his tone defensive. Which means he remembers the old days, Sophia shot back. He remembers a time when the Morettis were undisputed kings, not corporate chief executive officers like you are trying to be. Maybe he thinks you have gone soft, Dante. Maybe he thinks your father has gotten too old. Maybe he wants the crown for himself. Dante shot to his feet, pacing back and forth in the narrow confines of the tunnel. I need a phone. I have to call this in. If you call anyone, you will die, Sophia said, her voice unnervingly calm. They can track your voice print. They can triangulate your signal in seconds. If Rocco is the one behind this, then he has access to the National Security Agency level surveillance technology your family purchased last year. Dante stopped pacing and just looked at her. He really looked at her for the first time, seeing her in the dim light with dirt smudged on her face and a stolen, priceless briefcase resting on her lap. This was not the shy, quiet waitress from the restaurant. This was a general preparing for war. You seem to know an awful lot about our operations for a girl who just busses tables, Dante said, a clear note of grudging admiration in his voice. That was thick with menace. I have been observing you for 3 years now, Sophia said, her voice a low and steady threat. I know which restaurants you favor, the names of the people who share your bed, and exactly where you stash your hidden money. She leaned forward slightly. That was the Valente way, Dante. We never settled for just breaking knees. We made it our business to know everything, because knowledge is the one weapon that never, ever runs out of ammunition. Then why are we still alive? Dante asked, his own voice barely a whisper. You served my father his wine tonight. It would have been simple to slip cyanide into the glass. You were close enough to stab me with a steak knife. So why did you wait all this time? Sophia's gaze dropped to the briefcase on her lap. For just a fraction of a second, her expression softened, revealing the lost, 12-year-old girl who had seen her entire world burn to the ground. Because death is far too merciful, she whispered, the words filled with ancient pain. Your father was the one who murdered my mother. He was the one who killed my brothers. He set my home ablaze. If I simply put a bullet in his skull, he dies as a legend. He becomes the great Don Salvatore in death. She lifted her head, and her eyes were two burning coals. I refuse to let him die a legend. I want him to die as a complete and utter failure. I need him to witness his entire empire crumble into dust, piece by agonizing piece. And I need him to know that it was a Valente who stripped it all away from him, not with a gun, but with the unvarnished truth. She placed a hand firmly on the briefcase. This briefcase holds that truth, Dante. It is the Libro Rosso, the Red Book. She let the weight of those words settle in the damp air. Inside is all the evidence detailing the collaboration between the 5 families and the corrupt senators, the judges on their payroll, and the union leaders in their pockets. If I decide to release this information, the Federal Bureau of Investigation does not just come and arrest you. They will completely dismantle the entire corrupt ecosystem you inhabit. The Moretti name will be turned to ash. Dante could only stare at the case. That book is a fairy tale. It is a myth. My father told me it was destroyed in the fire that consumed your house. My father threw it out the window to Enzo just moments before the roof caved in, Sophia countered without hesitation. Dante dragged a hand through his thick hair, his world tilting on its axis. He was utterly trapped. He was standing in a filthy sewer with a woman who possessed the power to obliterate everything he had ever known. And just outside this tunnel, a traitor was actively hunting them both. So, Dante finally said, his voice low and heavy with resignation. What is the plan now? You release the contents of that book, I get sent to prison, and you finally get the revenge you've been waiting for. I cannot release it just yet, Sophia admitted, the confession sounding like a weakness she hated to show. The files are heavily encrypted. The key to unlock them is incredibly complex. And if I come out of hiding to try and decrypt it, Rocco's death squad will find me. Now that they are aware you survived, they will eventually find you as well. She pushed herself to her feet, wincing as she put pressure on her injured left leg. We have a significant problem, Dante. We are natural-born enemies. By every law of our world, I should probably kill you this very moment and take my chances alone, and you should be trying to choke me out and seize that book for yourself. But, Dante interjected, taking a deliberate step closer to her, if we do that, then Rocco is the one who wins. He will seize the throne, he will bury my father with false honors, and he will hunt us down, one by one, until we are both dead. Exactly, she conceded. Dante slowly extended his hand. It was an act of pure insanity, a Moretti offering a handshake to a Valente. The gesture defied more than 100 years of violent, blood-soaked history between their families. A truce, Dante said, his voice firm. Just until we can survive the night. And until we can confirm if it is really Rocco behind all of this, I will help you get to a place of safety. In return, you do not release the book." Sophia stared at his outstretched hand. She saw the scars that crisscrossed his knuckles. Then she looked into his eyes. They were surprisingly gentle for a man who had been raised by a complete monster. But she did not take his hand. "I do not shake hands with Moretti's," she said, her tone as cold as ice. "But I suppose I will not kill you tonight. You should lead the way, boss. You obviously know this city much better than I do." Dante let his hand fall to his side, a small wry smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "You are genuinely terrifying. Has anyone ever told you that?" "I am just a waitress," she replied, her face a perfect mask of indifference. "Right, and I am merely a waste management consultant," he retorted. Dante gestured down the dark tunnel. "There is an exit point not far from Chelsea. I have a safe house there, one that is completely off the books. Not even my own father knows it exists. It is an artist's loft. I keep it for my private time." "You mean for your mistresses?" Sophia asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she limped past him into the darkness. "I mean for my painting," Dante corrected her, his tone defensive. Sophia actually stopped and looked back over her shoulder, her expression one of genuine surprise. "You paint?" "Everyone needs to have a hobby," Dante grumbled, pushing past her. "Come on, let us go before the rats down here get any braver." They moved together through the oppressive darkness, two heirs to a shattered kingdom, walking toward a new day that promised nothing but more blood. But as they walked, the very dynamic between them began to shift. They were no longer the hunter and the hunted. They had become partners. And in the criminal underworld, a partnership, born from sheer necessity, is frequently more powerful than a marriage born from love. Yet neither of them saw the tiny blinking red light on the briefcase's handle. It was not a bomb. It was a high-tech tracker. And far away, in a luxurious penthouse with a view of Central Park, Rocco smiled as he watched the small blip move slowly beneath 10th Avenue. "I have you now," Rocco whispered to himself, swirling the amber cognac in his glass. "Kill the father, kill the son." His smile widened. "And bring me the girl. That Valente witch has something in her possession that belongs to me." The safe house was nothing at all like Sophia had expected. She had been picturing a concrete bunker, a windowless room with an arsenal of guns mounted on the walls, and bare mattresses thrown on the floor. Instead, Dante unlocked a door that led her into a massive, high-ceilinged loft in the heart of Chelsea. The air inside smelled of turpentine and linseed oil, not of gunpowder and fear. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with canvases, displaying huge, chaotic, and breathtakingly beautiful paintings. There were violent, expressive swirls of deep red and stark black, faces that seemed to be screaming in utter silence, and hands desperately reaching for a help that was never going to arrive. "You really do paint," Sophia whispered, her voice filled with awe as she let the heavy briefcase drop onto a pristine white sofa. She found herself walking toward a large canvas that was still on an easel. It was clearly unfinished. It was a portrait of a woman with profoundly sad eyes. "It helps keep the ghosts quiet," Dante explained as he locked the heavy steel door behind them, engaging a complicated keypad deadbolt. He moved over to a small kitchenette and pulled out a fully stocked first aid kit. "Sit down. Let me take a look at that leg." Sophia hesitated for a moment, then sat gingerly on the edge of the sofa. The adrenaline that had been coursing through her was finally fading, and it was being replaced by a deep, throbbing ache in her calf, where she had scraped it on the pier. Dante knelt down in front of her. With a pair of medical shears, he carefully cut away the torn, blood-stained fabric of her waitress uniform. His hands, which she knew could be so dangerous, were now unbelievably gentle. "It is a shallow wound," he said softly, dabbing antiseptic onto the raw skin. "You will not be needing any stitches." "You have very good hands," Sophia murmured, her eyes fixed on him as he worked. "For a Moretti." Dante stopped what he was doing and looked up at her. Their faces were only inches apart. The tension that filled the room suddenly changed. It was no longer the sharp tension of survival. It was something else, something magnetic, and far more complicated. "And you have a lot of secrets," Dante replied, his voice just as soft. "For a Valente." He finished applying the bandage to her leg, but he did not move away. "Why did you save my life tonight, Sophia? The real reason. You could have just let those mercenaries take me out. It would have been one less Moretti for you to worry about." Sophia's gaze drifted back to the painting of the sad woman on the easel. "Because I saw you tonight. I remember that night in the restaurant, the way your father tore me down with his words. I saw you flinch. I felt how much you hated him in that moment. You are not him, Dante." "But I am," Dante countered, the bitterness sharp in his voice as he rose and stalked to the window, pulling the blinds apart to stare into the darkness. "I run his corrupt business. I cover up his violent mistakes. I am the one who will inherit his dirty throne." Sophia's voice was soft but firm. "That doesn't make you a king. It makes you a prisoner," she corrected him. "It's exactly what I was. We are not heirs, Dante. We are just two children, trying to clean up the blood our fathers spilled." Hearing this, Dante turned back to face her, and the carefully constructed mask of the Mafia prince had completely crumbled. For the first time, she saw the raw vulnerability beneath. He was just a boy, lost and broken. An invisible force seemed to pull him back toward her, a gravitational pull he had no strength to resist. He reached for her, his hand coming up to gently cup her face, his fingertips brushing against her cheek. Sophia did not pull back or show any fear. Instead, she leaned into his warm touch, a silent acceptance passing between them as her eyes closed. "If we can somehow get out of this alive," Dante whispered, the words a fragile promise. "I swear I am done. I am leaving this life behind for good. I will take enough money to vanish and never look back." Sophia's eyes opened again, the sad reality returning. "There is no leaving," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "Not for people like us. Not while a man like Rocco is hunting us down. And especially not while that little book still exists." Her gaze drifted down to the briefcase on the floor. An icy wave of realization suddenly crashed over her, making her skin crawl. "Dante," she said, her voice becoming sharp and urgent. "The handle." He looked confused. "What are you talking about?" She pointed. "The handle of the case. I just touched it. It is warm." The confusion on Dante's face instantly turned to pure, wide-eyed terror. He lunged for the briefcase, and immediately flipped it over. There, embedded in the matte black steel near the hinge, was a tiny pulsing red light, no bigger than the head of a pin. "Tracker," Dante hissed, the word a curse. "High frequency. How long has it been active?" Sophia was already on her feet, ignoring the sharp pain that shot up her leg. Dante glanced at his watch, his mind racing through calculations. "If he started tracking us from Red Hook, then he is not coming here alone. He is bringing the entire hammer down on us." Crack! The massive skylight above them exploded into a shower of glass. It was happening exactly as it had with Enzo. History was repeating itself with terrifying precision. Ropes dropped down from the ceiling. But this time, Dante was prepared. He grabbed Sophia and tackled her, pulling her behind a heavy oak drafting table just as the room began to fill with tear gas. "Gas! Masks are under the sink!" Dante yelled, firing his handgun blindly over the top of the table. A second later, the main door to the loft blew inward with a deafening boom. Through the swirling smoke, several figures began to emerge. But these were not just mercenaries this time. Leading the charge, wearing a tactical gas mask that made him look like some kind of mechanized insect, was Rocco, and he was dragging someone with him. Dante squinted his eyes against the stinging gas. His father, Don Salvatore Moretti, was thrown onto the floor in the center of the room. He was not tied up, but he was completely disoriented, coughing violently from the gas. Rocco ripped his own mask off his face, a shark-like smile spreading across his lips as the loft's powerful ventilation system began to suck the gas out of the air. "Come on out, Dante," Rocco shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Come out and introduce your new girlfriend to your father properly." Dante glanced over at Sophia, his expression grim. "He is using him as a human shield." "No," Sophia said, her mind working furiously. "This is not a shield. He is setting a stage. He wants Salvatore to see the two of us together. He wants to frame you for all of this." "We have to end this right now," Dante said, his voice hard as steel. He quickly checked his magazine. "I have 6 rounds left, and I count at least 10 men." "I have the book," Sophia said with determination, "and I know the code." She took a deep breath and stood up. "Sophia, no!" Dante reached out to grab her, but she was already moving. She walked out from behind the safety of the table, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender, the steel briefcase held firmly in her left hand. "Hold your fire!" Rocco screamed to his men. His grin widened. "Well, look at this. The little waitress returns." Don Salvatore pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, looking frail and utterly confused. He looked up and his eyes locked on Sophia. Then he saw his son, Dante, emerge from behind her, his gun still raised. "Dante," Salvatore rasped, his voice a broken shell of what it once was. You are with her? You are with the Valente girl?" "He told you that I kidnapped her, did he not, Don Salvatore?" Sophia asked, her voice surprisingly calm and steady. Audible sigh that barely echoed through the expansive loft. She then walked until she was just 10 feet away from Rocco. "He came to me," Salvatore spat, his anger returning like a wildfire, "and he told me my own son had turned against me. He said you were selling our most guarded secrets to the Valentes. He claimed you were planning to murder me and seize the crown for yourself." "And you actually took his word for it?" Dante shouted, the barrel of his gun now fixed firmly on Rocco's forehead. "Papa, you have to look at him. He was the one who hired the Russians. He was the one who tried to have me killed down at the pier." "These are lies," Rocco said, his voice as smooth and cold as polished stone. He casually pressed the muzzle of his own pistol against Salvatore's temple. "Drop your weapon, Dante, or the old lion goes to sleep for good tonight." The entire room went still. It was a perfect, deadly standoff. Dante knew he could not possibly shoot Rocco without sacrificing his father's life. In that moment, Rocco controlled the entire situation. "Are you looking for the book, Rocco?" Sophia asked suddenly, lifting the leather briefcase into view. "This is the item you truly desire, isn't it?" "Give that to me now," Rocco demanded, his eyes fixed on the case. "Do it, and I might consider letting the boy live. As for the old man, well, his time has come to an end regardless." "You do not want the book for the leverage it holds over the senators," Sophia declared, her voice growing stronger and clearer with every word. "You want it because of what is written on page 42. Rocco's eyes flickered for just a fraction of a second, a tiny, almost imperceptible signal of pure panic. "What could possibly be on page 42? Salvatore asked, his gaze shifting between Rocco and the waitress. "It contains the complete list of your skimming operations, from 1995 all the way to 2005, Sophia lied. She had no idea what the real page number was, but she knew the crime intimately. She had spent countless hours studying Enzo's detailed notes. "Rocco did more than just serve you, Don Salvatore. He was systematically robbing you. He took 10% from every single shipment that came through. He constructed his own secret empire using the crumbs from your table." "She is lying," Rocco screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger of his gun. "Kill them! Kill them both right now!" "Wait," Sophia shouted over the chaos. "I will open it. I will show you the proof." She carefully placed the briefcase on the cold floor. She knelt down beside it. She began to turn the combination dials. 12, 25, 98. The date her childhood home was burned to the ground. It was her father's dark, twisted sense of humor. Click, The metal latches popped open with a sharp sound. Rocco took a step forward, his greed finally eclipsing his caution. He roughly pushed Salvatore aside, his gun now aimed directly at Sophia. "Show it to me." Sophia lifted the lid of the case. Inside, there was nothing. It was completely empty. Rocco just stared into the void. "Where is it? Where is the book?" Sophia slowly looked up at him, a terrifying, confident smile spreading across her face. "I burned it 3 years ago, Rocco. The leverage was never in the book." She calmly tapped her temple with her index finger. "It is all in here." Rocco's face contorted into a mask of pure fury. "You—" He raised his pistol, ready to execute her on the spot. Bang! But the shot did not come from Dante's gun. Rocco's body went rigid. A look of complete and utter shock washed over his features. He glanced down at his chest. A red flower of blood was rapidly blooming across his white shirt. He turned his head with agonizing slowness. Don Salvatore Moretti was standing there, holding a tiny .22 caliber pistol that he had just pulled from a hidden ankle holster. It was the one place Rocco had forgotten to check. "You stole from me, Rocco," Salvatore whispered, his voice shaking with a terrible, contained rage. "You stole from my family." Rocco made a gurgling sound as blood filled his throat, and he collapsed to his knees. I made you." "You are nothing," Salvatore said, his voice filled with contempt. He fired the pistol a second time. Bang! Rocco's body slammed onto the floor. The mercenaries, seeing their paymaster was now dead, exchanged uncertain glances. They were professionals, not loyalists. No payment meant no fight. "Leave!" Dante roared, gesturing fiercely with his gun toward the shattered doorway. "Get out of here before I call the New York Police Department." The mercenaries did not need to be told twice. They scrambled out of the broken doorframe and melted away into the darkness of the city night. An immense silence descended upon the loft, a quiet that felt heavier and more profound than all the noise that came before. Don Salvatore stood over Rocco's lifeless body, his breathing heavy and ragged. The small gun fell from his hand, and he slumped weakly against a concrete pillar. Dante holstered his own weapon and immediately rushed to his father's side, catching the old man just before he could slide all the way to the floor. "Papa," Dante said, his fingers pressing against the old man's wrist to check his pulse. "Are you all right?" "I am old," Salvatore grumbled, trying to push Dante away with what little strength he had left. "But I am not dead." He straightened his expensive coat, then his eyes found Sophia. She was still kneeling on the floor next to the empty briefcase. Salvatore used his cane, which Rocco had tossed aside, to tap against the metal case. "You lied," he rasped, his voice still strained. "You lied about the book." "I bluffed," Sophia corrected him calmly, rising to her feet with grace. "A Valente always knows how to play a hand of poker." Salvatore stared at her, truly studying her for the first time. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the room was the wind howling through the broken skylight above them. He looked at her face, examining every feature, and he finally saw the ghost of Giovanni Valente looking back at him. "You have your father's eyes," Salvatore said, his voice now quiet and reflective. "And you have his stubbornness." "And you now have a debt to repay," Sophia replied, her voice unwavering. "I saved your son from certain death. I saved your entire empire from a traitor. And I spared your life down in that sewer when I could have easily let you rot." Salvatore considered her words, and then nodded slowly. "This is the truth. The Omerta is clear on this matter. A life for a life." He reached deep into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy, ornate gold ring. It was the Moretti signet. He looked from Dante to Sophia. "I am tired, Dante," Salvatore sighed, the weight of the night finally settling upon him. "Tonight, I have learned that I cannot place my trust in the men I have raised, except for you." He then turned his gaze to Sophia. "The feud between our families ends this evening. The Valentes are gone. You are now Sophia Rossi. You work as a waitress, is that correct? Sophia hesitated for a moment. She glanced over at Dante and saw the overwhelming hope shining in his eyes. Yes, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. I am just a waitress. Good, Salvatore said with a firm nod. My son needs a good woman by his side, not another soldier. But, he paused, narrowing his eyes at her, though the corner of his mouth twitched upward. If I ever hear you speak that dialect in a public place again, I will have no choice but to fire you. Dante let out a laugh. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief that filled the broken room. He wrapped his arm securely around Sophia's waist, pulling her tightly against him. Let us get you home, Papa, Dante said. The grand reopening of Il Gioiello was the most talked-about event of the season. The press was out in full force, their cameras flashing as they snapped photographs of famous politicians and celebrities. However, the true center of power was located at Table 1 on the mezzanine level. Dante Moretti was seated at the head of that table. He was not wearing a simple suit. He was dressed in a fine tuxedo, but his bow tie was artfully loosened. He looked completely at ease, and happier than anyone had ever seen him. Don Salvatore sat at his right hand, appearing frail, but deeply content as he sipped his expensive Barolo. The quality of the service here has certainly improved, Salvatore commented, his eyes scanning the busy floor below. That is because I have a new manager, Dante replied with a wide grin. Just then, Sophia walked up to their table. She was no longer in a waitress uniform. She was wearing a breathtaking backless red dress that likely cost more than the used car she once drove. She was not carrying a tray. She carried herself with the poise and confidence of a queen. Gentlemen, she said, placing her hand gently on Dante's shoulder. Is everything to your liking this evening? It is perfect, amore, Dante said, lifting her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. Salvatore looked up at her, a critical expression on his face. The wine is excellent, but the bread is cold. Sophia did not even flinch. She leaned down, bringing her lips very close to the old Don's ear, and whispered in a perfect, heavy Sicilian dialect, Eat the bread you are given, old wolf, or the cook might decide to put you on a very strict diet. Salvatore went completely still for a second. Then he threw his head back and let out a laugh. It was a loud, booming laugh that was so powerful it caused the entire restaurant to turn and look in their direction. She is terrifying, Salvatore told his son, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. You must keep her. Sophia simply smiled, gave Dante's hand a gentle squeeze, and walked away to greet the other important guests. She was no longer an invisible girl, easily overlooked. She was now Sophia Moretti, the woman who had successfully tamed the lions of New York. And as she moved with elegance through the crowded room, nobody dared to look away from her. And that is the story of how the shy waitress, who once trembled while holding a simple glass of water, became the undisputed queen of New York City. She did not use a gun or violence to win her war. She used her heritage, her sharp wit, and the one weapon the Mafia never anticipated. She used the truth. Sophia proved that in a world filled with wolves, the most dangerous creature is not always the one with the biggest teeth. It is the one who knows precisely when and where to bite. Sophia's journey teaches us something profound. Never underestimate the quiet ones. The person pouring your water, the server you never look at twice, the nobody standing in the corner. They see everything. They hear everything. And when the moment comes, they can change the entire game. This story also reminds us that revenge is not always about destruction. Sometimes the greatest victory is choosing to rise above the pain and build something new from the ashes. Sophia could have killed Don Salvatore when she had the chance. Instead, she chose to become the queen of his empire. For those of you who have ever been dismissed, looked down upon, or called nothing, remember Sophia. Your invisibility is your armor, your silence is your strategy, and your moment of triumph is coming. So, what is your opinion? Do you think Sophia made the correct choice by saving the very man who had destroyed her entire family? Or do you believe she should have taken her revenge when she had the chance? Let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this tale of betrayal, romance, and brutal Sicilian justice, please smash that like button, hit subscribe, and be sure to ring the notification bell so you never miss a single story. We have a new thriller coming out next week that you absolutely will not believe. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay dangerous. This content was carefully researched, crafted, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful lessons and inspiration. Every story we share is designed to touch your heart and remind you of your own strength. Thank you for being part of our community,